resort. All that said, why should I now advocate elevating this quaint pagan religious ritual that functioned as little more than window dressing for self-aggrandizing Roman imperial ambitions into the preeminent concern in contemporary just war discourse? There's a serious reason behind the proposal, and it's a grave concern provoked by the increasingly rapid pace of lethal military technologies, the dimensions of which were the subject of last year's McCain conference. All of those technologies, robotics, non-lethal weapons, virtual cyber conflict, offer prospects of enhancing the reach of the warfighter, making it safer for warriors to engage in combat, and by their precision and sophistication, reducing the widespread destruction and indiscriminate killing that figure so large in proportionality calculations. Precisely in so doing, paradoxically, they raise what I collectively term the threshold problem. That is, each distinctive technology, by making warfare more precise and less destructive, threatens to lower the threshold for going to war and erode the last resort concept. This warning was first explicitly raised in a seminal essay on ethics and information warfare by John Arquilla at the Rand Corporation in the late 1990s. John, who actually coined the term cyber warfare, he's the one who invented it, is my colleague in defense analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School. But one also finds echoes of this concern, for example, in the work of Michael Ignatieff on virtual war in the aftermath of the Kosovo air campaign. The more precise we can make war, the more precision weapons we develop, the more likely we can use them and justify using them via the proportionality calculations of the sort that Professor Herka suggested. Also, you find this concern raised with the rapid advent of not just precision weaponry in the 1990s, but now military robotics, soldier enhancements, and non-lethal weapons in the past decade in the work of people like Pete Singer in his book, Wired for War. He raises this concern many times. It's going to lower the threshold. We're going to go to war more readily. Article in the New York Times on this topic, November of this past year. A report sponsored by the Office of Naval Research and authored by my young colleague Patrick Lynn, last year's Stockdale Fellow, and the father of American robotics, George Becky, raises this report over and over and over and over again in the literature on military technologies and warfighting. You will see the threshold problem raised with respect to all the advent of all these new ways of pursuing warfighting. That threshold problem is generated, however, by interpreting last resort as Professor Herka does, wholly as, in effect, he writes, a comparative version of the initial simple proportionality condition. This is a quote from a paper of his in 2005, very widely read and very influential and helpful. For war and each of its alternatives, one does a proportionality calculation, identifying the relevant goods and evils, with a focus on relevant, that it will produce compared to a baseline of doing nothing or continuing to act as one would have had acted if there had been no just cause, and then says the war is permitted only if its net outcome is better than those of all alternatives. That's a quote from that paper, but you heard a similar formulation this afternoon. If Herka is correct, and indeed if the prevailing interpretations of last resort by Brian Oren, Martin Cook, the Catholic bishops, and many others, almost everybody in fact, as entailing essentially a comparative calculation of the net utility of warfighting compared to its alternatives, then these recent concerns for what Arquilla first termed the erosion of the principle do follow, because the warfighting technologies in question all promise to transform those comparative calculations of proportionality in dramatic fashion. At its heart, however, that quaint Roman religious custom seems normatively to entail good faith efforts to explore alternatives before presuming to cross what Martin Cook in his account defines as a very bright line, going to war. And that language doesn't sound like a proportionality or utility calculation at bottom, but instead seems to invoke a principle. That Herka's, and indeed nearly everyone's, customary utilitarian interpretation of the last resort principle of necessity are incorrect, in fact, I believe can be easily demonstrated, and that demonstration helps ameliorate this widespread current anxiety about technology that wars will inevitably become, as a result, easier to fight. Last resort is not uniquely a category or criterion of just war discourse, as I indicated earlier, but it is invariably and consistently a category in any and every moral discussion of exemption or exception. Indeed, in all of these discussions, the principle of last resort always figures as the key, essential, or core consideration, the sole necessary consideration, if you will, in deciding to make oneself an exception or grant oneself an exemption to rules or principles that otherwise are considered inviolable and universally applicable. The last resort criterion is essential to discussions, therefore, of lying and truth-telling, to the use of force generally, as in domestic law enforcement or in cases of individual self-defense, to killing particularly, as well as to disobeying orders, conscientious objection, or civil disobedience and the law. We are, in general, beseeched not to do these things, not to kill or to lie or to use force to settle disputes or disobey a lawful order or disobey or disrespect the law itself. When we nonetheless do any of these things, we're at minimum required to provide a compelling reason or justification, to be sure, but even more importantly, we are required to have first engaged in good faith attempts at less drastic alternatives before engaging in the proscribed behavior. This last resort requirement is imposed not because of the calculus of consequences, which famously can often be, or at least seem, quite favorable to the otherwise proscribed behavior, as in many instances of lying. Rather, it serves as a side constraint on such calculations. It depends, that is the last resort or necessity criterion depends, notwithstanding the results of the calculations. It demands that we do not willingly violate principles that we otherwise properly hold to rightly constrain our own and everyone else's permissible conduct in these otherwise disparate matters. In all these instances of breaking rules or exempting oneself from morality's standard operating procedures, one is required first to attempt less drastic alternatives. Not drastic in the sense of degree of destruction, as wrongly thought in the case of war, but in terms of violation of principle, to have made every attempt, that is to say, to avoid having to violate the principle in question, lest, as Cicero remarks in the case of war, we invoke the wrath of the gods. In sum, if the principle of last resort is interpreted, as nearly everyone does interpret it, as simply another in a list of proportionality considerations entailing a comparative calculus of expected net utility values, then the pundits and critics of emerging military technologies, and for that matter, the increased reliance on private military contractors, are correct. These calculations are all subject to change as we factor in their increased reliance on contractors and robots, or the increasing availability of non-lethal weapons or cyber weapons. Any principle or rule of thumb grounded in such calculations, as the critics fear, are thus subject to erosion. On my interpretation of the origins and proper understanding of the last resort principle, however, these developments in themselves have no bearing whatsoever on the decision to resort to war. One remains obligated to attempt in good faith not having to resort to war, because wars, like lying and killing and law-breaking, are things we generally disapprove of and do not think it morally right for ourselves or anyone else to undertake. And that remains the case no matter what weapons or tactics we develop or bring to the table. And it demonstrates decisively, as I've long maintained, that the discussion of war needs to be included in this wider deontological family of moral discourse about exceptions or exemptions generally, from which it has, throughout its otherwise venerable history, strangely been isolated. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, and thank you for the wonderful use of the word beseech. We don't hear that enough in our dialogue and discourse. Our final panelist of the day is William H. Shaw, A.B. Stanford, Ph.D., London School of Economics and Political Science, Professor of Philosophy at San Jose State University, where he was chair of the philosophy department for 11 years and the university's 1988-1999 President Scholar. Bill has also been a Fulbright lecturer and a von Humboldt Fellow and served for 2 years as the resident director of the California State University's System Study Abroad program at the University of Zimbabwe. In addition to essays in a variety of professional journals, he is the author of Marx's Theory of History, more on right and wrong, contemporary ethics taking account of utilitarianism, business ethics, and with Vincent Barry, moral issues in business. He is also currently a fellow at the Stockdale Center. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Let me begin by thanking Colonel Art Athens and his colleagues for extending to me the privilege of being at the Naval Academy this year. It's been, unfortunately, time is winding down now, but it's been a great pleasure and a great benefit to me personally, so I thank you and your colleagues very much. I might, among his many colleagues, mention especially Ed Barrett, who directs the fellow seminar, and in addition, of course, to being responsible for organizing this conference. And most of the people that we've heard from today are people we've read in our seminar, and same tomorrow, and several of them have been kind enough to come to Annapolis and speak with us, or in the case of David Roden, by transatlantic telephone call to communicate with us. So it's a little bit intimidating to come at the end of this August group, especially when you're defending a position that you know they all disagree with, because I'm going to take up the cudgels for the utilitarian approach to when it's legitimate to wage war. It sort of fits in with our previous speakers, because if George Wright, Professor Herka wants to sort of expand proportionality to include everything else, and George wants to expand last resort to include everything else, and I'm going to use utility to include everything else that we should be taking account of when we go to war. It's also a little bit uncomfortable to be a utilitarian and sort of standing between you and the buffet in a few minutes. Whether you want to drink beer and play pushpin with Bentham, or sip single malt and talk art with John Stewart and Harriet Taylor Mill, either way, it's her problem. But so I will try to be succinct and just give you a few points from a longer paper that I'm working on that you're happy to write me for a copy if you've been interested in it. So I'll sort of kind of gesture at some of the things that I'm interested in, or some of the points I want to make. To begin with, well, I'll sort of state the sort of basic utilitarian view of war and say a couple things in its favor, and try to situate it with respect to the traditional principles of just war theory with respect to the ad bellum aspect of war. Utilitarian principle with regard to war is pretty simple. It holds that it's morally right for a state to wage war if and only if no other course of action would have better results, or more specifically, if and only if no other course of action would result in greater expected well-being. Otherwise, it's wrong to wage war. Now, there's a lot that's simple and straightforward, and there's lots of behind-the-scenes intramural debate among utilitarians and consequentialists about exactly how to formulate that standard, and I won't go into that. I'll just mention a couple brief things about the interpretation of that very simple principle. One is there's different kinds of wars that can be fought, various strengths of war or types of war, and of course that's going to be considered by the utilitarian criteria, because what you're comparing is the particular type of war you're entertaining fighting versus other possible wars, or no war at all, or other kinds of action that you may take. Likewise, or not likewise, but similarly, the utilitarian criteria is about waging war, not just about going to war as if it were a one-time decision. Utilitarianism is a notoriously forward-looking criteria, and so it's possible that you were justified in utilitarian grounds or not in going to war or not going to war, but some years farther down the road, the situation may be changed, and so you may be justified now in continuing to fight or stopping fighting, whereas just the reverse of what you were before. Finally, just on the kind of preliminary contents, there's a sort of asymmetry in practice in many wars, in that the costs of the war are sort of going to be upfront and immediate and undeniable. That people will be killed, maimed, things destroyed, life disrupted. Whereas often the looked for benefits are farther in the future and a little less secure. Now that doesn't affect the deep logic of the utilitarian criterion, but in practice, that epistemic imbalance may give you some pause when you're reflecting on the possibility of war from a utilitarian point of view. You may want to put your thumb a little bit more heavily on the scale against war when it's all the negative things are virtually certain and the positive ones, even though